Hello, YouTube. I want to talk about why I left my house in the Houston area. My wife was a victim of special crimes by members of her family. They got her addicted to drugs, and she died on my birthday, nearly 6 years ago now. But that's not where the biggest problems began. The biggest problems that we had, it was devastating when she died, but what followed made things even worse. I got sick with mono that she had given me. And in the months that followed, her mother demanded that we go to a holiday celebration over at her house. And unfortunately, I had given her our home address. That's where our problems began. So when we refused to go over there, she started filing false reports to the police and to social services. And we could not get retaliation protection, even though I gave them evidence to prove that members of her family were criminals. The harassment from social services and child protective services and law enforcement, mostly social services, continued for the next 3 years, an average of one visit every 3 to 4 months. And it came to the point that I was having nightmares about engaging in armed conflict with their staff. The trauma that they inflicted on our family was so great that I was having nightmares about fighting them. And it wasn't just me. It was the same with my children. We were all dreaming about them. And they made illegal demands. They demanded I get a storage. They demanded that I break off a relationship with a same-sex partner that I had simply because we were the same sex. And my partner was older. And ultimately, what ended up happening was, on a secondary basis, because people saw that we were getting visits from the agency, these people burglarized our home. And then since we were already getting visits from the agency, they just doubled down. My kids were being visited at school in addition to the fact that our home was being visited. And I wasn't being notified of those visits or being given any written explanation. There was no due process being observed. I even had a law enforcement officer and a social worker cut through a chain on my front gate without probable cause or a warrant. And then after the fact, the officer lied about doing so. And during that time, we were dealing with storm damage from Harvey. Now, what ended up happening here is because the illness that I had was very serious, and I was also simultaneously grieving heavily, along with my children, at the fact that I had lost my significant other and they have lost their mother. All these things culminated in us becoming very, very overwhelmed by the circumstances that we dealt with. And I asked for utility assistance and financial assistance fixing the house. And we were all sick from the conditions that the mold caused in the house, as well as the extreme stress that we were being placed under by Child Protective Services. Now, how this ended up playing out was, eventually, after the crime victimization from the house being burglarized twice and then being threatened by the people with violence or death if we returned, I moved away from the house permanently. This is a house that was bought with my children's college money in the form of a down payment and money from a settlement received for my father being killed in a roadway incident. I can't really discuss the details of that, but the point is that we were all in. It took our entire life savings and all of our investments to get the property. Between crime victimization by my spouse's family, the spouse that had died, and secondary crime victimization by other people in the community there, and then the threats that we had to deal with, and dealing with oppression from an abusive government, I do not support Texas government. We ultimately decided to move to Central Texas. I thought that that would help if we were a couple hundred miles away from where all this bullshit was going on. But it didn't help. What ended up happening was I ended up having to leave my Central Texas home as well because the harassment continued. We had 4 additional visits there. I finally realized that it wasn't going to stop. So almost every day for the last 3 years, I've written letters to the White House, the governor of Texas, and various politicians at the public policy level, trying to get them to amend social welfare policy so that people cannot use anonymous reporting to swat innocent people who are victims of crime simply on the basis that those people have children. That's what they were doing. People were using the anonymous reporting feature of the Texas social welfare system to inflict massive emotional and psychological trauma on me and my kids. And we lost our home because of it. I could have stayed there if I didn't have to deal with that constant oppression. In addition to the fact that we had direct criminal victimization being visited on our property and our family. And it got to the point that I was really writing a lot of letters about these problems because the trauma was cumulative and we had already had a lot of past trauma, some of which I couldn't even remember. And as time has gone on, I've learned of many of the things that were happening. And I realized that we were in a really particularly bad situation. We couldn't get support, legal aid or home repair assistance or anything for that matter from United Way or the Red Cross or the local resources that were supposed to help out. They looked at me and they made a lot of assumptions based off of my sex and my skin color. And they were wrong. In every single case, they were wrong. Just because someone looks like I do, they look like they're one thing or another. You cannot cookie cutter people who are victims of crime, who are survivors of horrific circumstances. You don't know from looking at somebody what they've been through. You can't make those assumptions. And anybody who's with those resources shouldn't be making those assumptions either because it's not appropriate. You don't know what has been done to somebody. You don't know what they've lived through. And so I ended up losing my home, something I'd always dreamed of having because I'd never had a home before in my life, because of social welfare oppression. And I wasn't doing anything wrong. Here's the important point. Me and another member of my household who are still alive were victims of these people, of my mother-in-law, my spouse, and members of the community there. We were victims, criminally victimized by these people in capacities that I don't even want to go into detail with in this video. It's just to say that most people who hear about it are really, really disturbed because it's terrible. The stuff that was done was terrible. One of us ended up in the hospital, and I actually separately ended up in the hospital for that virus that I was infected with, which she contracted, my spouse contracted through special crime victimization by someone else on a separate basis from all the other crap that I've shared in this video. What did the government do about all this stuff? They allowed themselves in Texas to be used as a weapon against my family. It's to the point that I went and I bought weapons. And I said, look, this isn't going to happen anymore. You know, I'm not going to allow it to happen anymore. I had to have that conversation with someone. I had to sit down and have that talk with somebody and tell them, you know, this isn't appropriate. This is illegal. These are suable offenses. This is something where I could go to court and I could get massive, massive winnings if I had the right representation. Because not only was it unlawful harassment, But we had grounds for special victim protections, and we were not given those protections at all. I mean, I have a child who was a victim of special crime. He was attacked by somebody. He ended up in the hospital. And though the perpetrator was dead, what the government in Texas was allowing to happen was they were allowing members of that person's family, both of those people, their family, to target the victim using child protective services. And I was put in such a position where I had to make some very difficult decisions. And I chose peace of mind for myself and my child's survivor in order to make sure that nobody could inflict any further psychological or emotional trauma on my child. And I would do anything for my kids. There is no line that I would not cross, and there's no law that I would not break. Because these people are wrong for what they've done. And that is what I've impressed upon the people who matter at the public policy level. Government should not be used as a weapon against people who are survivors of special crimes, especially children. And that is what happened. And because of that, we lost our home in Texas. Our home went to foreclosure. They were sending out letters, these different agencies and so forth, there at the end, right before the foreclosure happened, saying that our payments would be a quarter of what they had been if we just filed the appropriate paperwork. But because I couldn't physically be there in person at the house to receive those notices, I received them untimely. I got them a month after the foreclosure auction occurred. I had them forwarded. But I didn't know that I had received this stuff in the mail until after the deadline. And the result is that my credit ended up being ruined. And I haven't been able to have permanent housing where I had a lease or owned property in a very long time because I was trying to protect my family from additional trauma. I want to make it clear that whatever happens, I'm not going to allow my family to be traumatized by further unwanted government contact. And people need to take steps legislatively to make sure that they can't do this to anyone else. No government agency should be able to oppress innocent people for 6 years. You shouldn't have to look over your shoulder when you're a special victim or survivor of those things, especially as a child.